I think you can start now.
Okay, thank you very much. So, hello everybody. Thank you. This is a pretty novel experience for me being with you remotely in this way. I'm sorry I can't be there in person, but my travel this month just didn't really allow it. But still, I'm very glad to be able to talk to you virtually. So, I just wanted to check, can everyone sort of hear and understand me okay?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So I wanted, yes, to share with you just some reminiscences of the beginning of the QED project as I saw it and how I was involved in the first QED workshops. And then talk just a little bit about how I perceive progress in the field in the 20 years since QED, like whether we've realized, like to what extent we've realized the QED goals. So I first became aware of the existence of the QED project via the following email. This is the actual email. This is a slightly blown up version. Invitation to join the QED mailing list. So this is an invitation from Bob Boyer and me to join a public mailing list for the QED project. This list is for the discussion of the QED project for the verification of a significant body of mathematical thought based on minimal set-logical first principles. A more detailed description of the project's goals can be obtained by anonymous FTP from take the file manifesto from directory pub QED. So I wasn't actually a recipient of this message. It was sent to various luminaries of the theorem proving world, which included my then PhD advisor, Mike Gordon, and he forwarded it to me and various other people in our research group who we thought were interested in the formalization of mathematics. So indeed, I was very interested, and like a lot of other people in Cambridge, I did indeed join the mailing list, look at the manifesto. So the QED manifesto, which was originally just available online as an anonymous text file, but was later published in QED+20, began like this. QED is the very tentative title of a project to build a computer system that effectively represents all important mathematical knowledge and techniques. The QED system will conform to the highest standards of mathematical rigor, including the use of strict formality in the internal representation of knowledge and the use of mechanical methods to check proofs of the correctness of all entries in the system. And you can actually see the original manifesto at this URL. It went through several stages of evolution, but this is the original one. So that was the kind of top-level set of aims of the project. Now, of course, as the project itself noted, there are many existing efforts to do with the formalization of mathematics, and there were at the time many efforts to do with the formalization of mathematics. And so one section of the QED manifesto was essentially a critique of existing efforts. So these were criticized on a variety of different grounds. Too much code to be trusted, too strong a logic, too limited a logic, too unintelligible a logic, too unnatural a syntax. Parochialism, that is, people who just reinvent the wheel, not familiar with the existing field. Too little extensibility, too little heuristic search support, too little care for rigor, complete absence of interoperability, too little attention paid to ease of use. It's perhaps chastening to observe that a lot of these still apply to our current systems. In fact, I think there are no major theorem proving systems that are immune from at least one of these criticisms, and sometimes many at a time. But anyway, so the QED project began with this critique of current efforts. More generally, it was just observed in the manifesto that there was such an incompatible array of different theorem-proving tools with different foundations, different objectives, etc., etc. And so, in some sense, QED seemed to be just tackling a project that many people have already tackled. But what was distinctive about QED was that it really called attention to this excessive diversity, this balkanization, and also actually proposed concretely how to do something about it, that is, how to draw all these different participants into a unified project, and more importantly, it had a very specific approach to allowing people to continue to work with whatever foundations they were interested in. So it seemed at the outset that the people drafting the manifesto, and although it was an anonymous document, I think it was widely agreed that Gonthier was one of the main driving forces behind it. It had I think it conceded that at least in the short term there wasn't going to be any one foundation or one theorem proof system that was so clearly better than all the others that it would just dominate. And so they had a specific plan for how to allow people to use multiple different foundations while still, in some sense, doing something unified, being part of the same project. And so this was to have what they called a root logic, which was essentially meant to be used as a meta-logic to reason about other logics. So the objective of the root logic was to have something extremely simple. As this text says, its description requires only a few pages of typical logical mathematical text. And it should also be strong enough to do the sort of basic proofs that you need in proof theory, but not so strong that it itself started to become an object of controversy. You know, assume some strong axioms that some people don't believe in, etc. And it was hinted that one possible logic to use for this meta-logic might be primitive recursive arithmetic, PRA, which is essentially the sort of Skolem-Goodstein quantifier-free first-order arithmetic. And this indeed has been quite widely used with it in proof theory. If you look at a lot of texts on proof theory, very often they use PRA as the meta-logic of Girard's text, etc. Many presentations of Gödel's second theorem. And indeed, one interesting thing about PRA compared to the sort of typical logical framework meta-logic is that it does actually allow you to do proofs by induction, so potentially you can prove somewhat interesting meta-theorems, like if P is a theorem of hybrid logic, then P prime is a theorem of Zermelo-Fraenkel set theory, etc., etc. So that all looks somewhat reasonable and plausible. So this manifesto did indeed kick off a lot of discussion on the QED mailing list. Here's just a somewhat arbitrary list of some of the first discussion topics on the QED list, starting with the Let's Start by Rusty Lusk, and discussions of the base logic, how it relates to Bourbaki. Then there was some discussion of this popular idea of little theories, where you have relatively small axiomatic theories, and you interpret one and the other and instantiate them and so forth, and various other things. And then we had various people trying to pour cold water on the entire enterprise, and people started to ask, why should mathematicians be interested in QED, etc. So this is a somewhat arbitrary list, but what's interesting, I think, is it shows the diversity of approach. So, although the QED manifesto had an idea in mind, the discussion on the QED mailing list was much more wide-ranging, and to some extent it was just an excuse for people who are interested in formal mathematics to hang out and talk to each other, like a kind of special interest group for formalized mathematics, because let's face it, there aren't all that many of us. There certainly weren't then. So here's a typical message from Bob Boyer, which I picked out because I think it's interesting in a few respects. So first he explicitly talks about the large number of QED-like efforts that have been spread over the last 27 years. I hear rumours that the Polish Mizar effort may be the largest so far. What was interesting about that was that at the time, that was the first mention that many of us had ever heard of Mizar. So most of us in the sort of US and Western European tradition actually hadn't even heard of Mizar, had no idea that quietly behind the scenes they'd actually created the world's largest formalization, largest mathematical library. So that in itself was very interesting. I'll come back to that. But anyway, then Boyer goes on to say, well, one can ask the question whether any of the efforts now underway has enough support to achieve be doubtful whether external people and funding agencies like the fact that the field appears to be so heavily balkanized. And then he observed, people seem to tire of inventing new programming languages sometime around 1980 or so. So maybe someday the C and Fortran and proof checking systems will become clear. That was a joke. But I wonder, 20 years later, we are actually starting to reach such a situation. I mean, some theorem proving systems do seem to be reaching a critical mass. I think Koch and Isabel Hall, and to some extent some of the other versions of Hall are quite widely used. So it's, ACL2 and PBS also somewhat widely used, and a variety of other systems. But I still don't really see any sign that we're coalescing around just one or two. So anyway, that was the QED mailing list discussion, and as I say, it was somewhat wide-ranging, free-ranging, and so the next event in the kind of QED world was the first QED workshop in Argonne. This is Argonne National Labs, which is well known for all the great work they did, and especially first-order theorem proving. A lot of interesting stuff pioneered there. And it was an invitation-only event, and I suppose invitations were extended to people who were either known to be active in the field or who had been particularly contributors to the mailing list. So this is the Rogues Gallery at the first workshop, so that's me at the back, a much younger version of myself. There's Bob Boyer next to me, and the late Piotr Rudnitsky there, and many other people you recognize, and I think some of these people may actually be lurking in the audience there. So, there's actually quite a lot of official information about what went on at the first QED workshop here in this tech report. So this has a bunch of concrete information. So it talks about the list of participants. For example, Thomas Yeck, the famous set theorist, was there. He actually gave a talk from the perspective of a mathematician, which was actually, at best lukewarm about the whole idea of formalization. I remember after his talk, Andrei Tribolet stood up and said in a very aggressive fashion, I do not consider Professor Yeck to be competent to judge. And these polite Anglo-Saxons like myself all recoiled and wondered if these Central Europeans were all going to have a big fight. Then Andrei went on to say very emolliently, because Professor Yeck is an outstanding mathematician, and therefore he doesn't understand the needs of the kind of average mathematician. Projects like these are intended. So generally, the discussion was quite sharp. So if you read the official report, first it says, the most important conclusion drawn was that it's an idea worth pursuing a statement with which virtually all participants agreed, and that's quite true. On the other hand, it also hinted that there was pretty sharp disagreement. And indeed there was. I'll share with you my own less official recollections of the discussion. And I must say I often had this slightly uncomfortable feeling of being in a minority of one in a lot of these discussions. So here goes. This is basically something I originally wrote in an email to a colleague. I've censored some of the more offensive parts of it, but it still gives you some idea of how I viewed the discussion and how I actually started to feel rather left out. So I said, we spent about a day aimlessly discussing miscellaneous issues, and Chet Murthy was trying to push the idea of a project just to translate between the different systems. But the main body of discussion was about Mizar, because, as you know, Mizar was quite a novelty to us at that time. And there seemed to be a body of opinion to simply base the QED project on a re-engineered Mizar. Just, forget all this stuff about a meta logic and a group logic, and just, maybe slightly re-engineer Mizar and start from there. But then Bob Boyer presented something that was pretty similar to the original manifesto, so to embed the object logics in something like primitive recursive arithmetic, write a proof check for each system, and then try to establish these idea with a great deal of enthusiasm, whereas I was a bit more lukewarm. I mean, at least I wanted us to discuss the idea of what we're really gaining by doing this kind of meta-formalization. I mean, for example, if you're basically doing at least highly constructive proofs that intertranslations are possible, what do you really gain over just doing the translation, which was what Chet was describing. And so as I put it in my email, my attempts to introduce sanity, as I see it, into the discussion were all kind of down. And they just weren't at all interested in the kind of lessons that I had from the LCF school about the value of being able to write derived inference rules without having to prove them correct, just relying on correct by construction kernel, which is very relevant to the issue of proof translation, whether you get an infeasible blow-up in proof translation. So after arguing my corner for a while, I said eventually I realized I was just irritating people by my contribution, so I basically tried to give up contributing to the discussion. And then the strange thing was that, although it seemed in the morning everyone, at least except me, had quite happily agreed on this PRA metalogic, in the afternoon everyone behaved as if nothing at all had been decided, so people started debating this orthogonal question of user interfaces, and I kind of decided I was just annoying people, so I ought to shut up, but I have never found it very easy to do that. So, and increasingly I couldn't kind of contain my incredulity, so and now I was supported by a few other people, just started to get basic answers to basic questions like, what is the user interface to? Is it for doing meta proofs in PRA, or is it proofs in the embedded logic? There wasn't even anything about an actual QED prover. And nobody seemed to know the answer, and people then started debating about whether the base logic should be founded on set theory or type theory, but according to the discussion of the morning, there is no base logic. There's the root meta logic of PRA, but there's no preference, no reason to prefer one or the other basic logic. So it was as if the debate in the morning hadn't happened, or at least as if the debate in the morning hadn't been so one-sided. So as I said, I found the whole thing permeated by an air of total unreality. And then the next day, towards the end of the conference, Michael Beeson, I thought, provided quite a good stimulus for actually getting started, but it then seemed that the QED mailing list was just completely silent, so it looked as if nobody took it seriously. And so my summary was, I was happy enough to play my part, but it seemed to me that the so-called discussion had been utterly pointless. So from that perspective, it was a bit disappointing, but on the other hand, as I said, I met up with a few old friends like Chet Matthew and Paul Jackson, and met a few interesting new people. The most interesting thing was that I finally got to really know the Misa people, the two of the key Misa people, Piotr Rudnitsky and Andrei Trivolex, and had my very first demo of Misa in the bar. And as I said in this email, it quite impressed me in some ways, so I'll tell you more sometime. That was a bit of an understatement. It impressed me quite a lot, actually. And so as I noticed that I had a lot of common ground with Piotr and Andrei. So Piotr had this nice phrase, anyone who writes whole scripts is a friend of mine. And Andrei, who was very skeptical about automated theorem proving, had this phrase, proof is a pleasure that the machine should not deprive us of. So despite all the kind of sharp disagreements, I did actually find it tremendously useful and very enjoyable just getting to know a lot of new people. And I should say that even though Bob Boyer and I found ourselves on opposite sides of a lot of arguments, I also just enjoyed getting to know him a bit better. So anyway, that was that. That was the first workshop. And then, the following year, after more discussion on the QED workshop, we had a second workshop in Warsaw. And this one, I actually found a much more pleasant experience in the sense that I didn't get the feeling that I was the only one fighting some particular ideology. It was actually quite a wide-ranging discussion, and it was organized where a few people who were enthusiastic or passionate about some particular topic got to discuss that topic and to lead a debate on the subject. So, for example, there are a bunch of different topics. So, for example, Paul Jackson talked about whether you can resolve the tension between people who use different, interested in different foundations for philosophical reasons. And I, needless to say, got saddled with my pet topic, which was, is reflection practically necessary or not? So a lot of the original enthusiasts for the QED project were very much suffused with this idea of building up layers of metalogics and adding reflection principles. Not the somewhat more modest reflection in Kant, for example, that we have now, which is really just, at least conceptually, staying within one logic. They were really imagining that you'd, perhaps add inference rules of the form, if P is provable when you embed it in a formalized syntax, then you can deduce P as a theorem, and also talking about proving code correct. So, and I was a little skeptical about all that, as I still am, and so I was leading the discussion on that. And there were a lot of other interesting things discussed. So here's another list of the second part of the agenda. One somewhat unusual participant was John McCarthy, who had been specially invited. So actually I was originally supposed to be on the same plane from London with McCarthy, so I could truly be said to be on the same plane as John McCarthy, though not in the sense I might like. Unfortunately, my train broke down on the way to London, so I ended up missing the plane and spending the night on the floor of Heathrow Airport. But nevertheless, I was still met by Roman at the airport the following day. So anyway, John McCarthy was an important inspiration for the idea of proof check and formalization, but by this time I think he was somewhat remote from the day-to-day activities of people like us who are interested in formalizing mathematics. He gave this talk that he called heavy-duty set theory. It wasn't really clear how the title corresponded to the content of his talk. The content of his talk was more about the acute difficulties of formalizing what one might call common sense reasoning. So he rolled out his favorite example of this mutilated chessboard problem that I suspect many of you have seen before. The idea that if you take a conventional 8-legged chessboard and remove two diagonally opposite squares from it, leaving 62 squares remaining, can you cover the remainder of that board using 2x1 dominoes and perfectly cover the remaining 62 squares? And he was arguing about, in some sense, why the kind of clever, intuitive, common sense reason why you can't is difficult to formalize, and somehow this was supposed to be connected with the use of some set theory and some additional reasoning principles. It was a little vague. Anyway, it was an interesting experience, and it was certainly a salutary reminder to us that indeed formalizing some common sense reasoning is very difficult. So that was the second QED workshop, and that was a very interesting experience. I should say that after the QED workshop, a bunch of us, that is, for example, Paul Jackson, Randall Holmes, and myself, went to Białystok, where we actually sat down with Andrei Tribolet's, some of the other leading people in the field, like, Banserek and so on, and they actually taught us how to use Mizar, and, Andrei himself really took us through it. And that was actually quite an inspiring experience, because that led me to my interest in declarative proof, and so I implemented the Mizar mode for Hall, and then a bunch of other people took up the idea, and we had more and more Mizar-style interfaces, of which today, of course, Isabella Isar is by far the most widely used. So that was very interesting. And also, even though I'd grown up using higher-order logic theorem provers, I was actually, still am actually, more of the opinion that traditional set theory is a better foundation for doing mathematics. So I personally was quite happy just to, at least from a foundational perspective, throw in my lot with the Mizar people and try to formalize mathematics in set theory, even though I would prefer to architect the theorem prover in a different way. And so with Andrei and a few of the other Mizar people, we put together a kind of counter proposal to QED called the Warsaw Declaration. This was very short-lived, but it was essentially proposing a more unified system where we just choose one foundation, something a bit like first order set theory, and just go from there. And interestingly, Boyer, when we sent it to Bob Boyer, he said that actually he personally agrees with pretty much everything we wrote, but he just doesn't believe politically that it would fly because there are too many people committed to different foundations. So that never really went anywhere. But anyway, it was a very fun trip anyway. So anyway, that's enough reminiscences. Where do we stand today? We are 20 years on from our first workshop. Did the QED project succeed in its aims? I mean, I think you have to say, if you interpret the question in a direct sense, then no, really not at all. So the QED list, which was at one time really quite a lively discussion forum, tailed off without any clear endpoint. People just seemed to lose interest. No more workshops. And we don't today have anything like the system that was envisaged by QED, some kind of unified QED prover. And indeed, there's not very much use of metalogics to share results. I will talk a little about some exceptions in a couple of slides. And if anything, the kind of organization in the field that the QED project was a response to has, if anything, got even worse, because in the last few years we've had a whole new major foundation enterprise, namely homotopy type theory, and there's a whole new line of research growing from that. So it seems we're even further away from being able to agree on any sort of common foundations. So in the direct sense, the QED vision seems to have failed completely, but I would like to add some counter-arguments. So first, it certainly did have a lot of very positive side effects in terms of bringing together people. In particular, I would say it, in some sense, brought Mizar to the West, like made the rest of us aware of what great stuff Mizar had already done, and helped us to realize that we should learn some of its lessons. More generally, it brought together a whole lot of us who are interested in different theorem proving techniques. I mean, sometimes it just brought us together to sort of argue and squabble. But in many ways, I think it was very stimulating to actually mix up these different research groups like this. And even though QED itself hasn't really flown as a project, I would say formalization itself and theorem proving has never been healthier. We've made very substantial progress in 20 years when you look at the kind of theorems we can formalize, and also the improvements that have been made to the different systems, the improved levels of automation, interoperability, interfaces, etc. So we certainly have made progress, even in the absence of a unified vision like QED. And there are, in fact, a few approaches that are working and have even, so to speak, occasionally been used in anger for sharing proofs between different theorem proving systems. So let me just talk a little more about those 2 points. Of course, we're going to hear in the rest of this workshop about all the sort of great, substantial projects like the all-order theorem, the fly-spec project, the Kepler conjecture. But it's important to remember that we now have a sort of whole lot of what you might call sort of middle-ranking theorems that have been formalized. I mean, these are the sort of theorems that are nowhere near current research level, but are nevertheless the kind of things that not every undergraduate knows how to prove. One well-known example is Gödel's first incompleteness theorem. This was first proved by Shankar and MQ from the Boyer-Moore system. I think back in 1986, a very long time ago, even before QED. And that's been nicely bookended now because Larry Paulson has recently completed a proof of Gödel's second theorem in Isabel Hall. And then in between we have a lot of other non-trivial theorems like the Brauer fixed point theorem, the Jordan curve theorem, the prime number theorem, the content theorems. I think some of these theorems would have seemed improbable, if not actually outlandish, 20 years ago that we would have formalized these. In fact, so with the prime number theorem, I formalized a complex analytic proof of the prime number theorem. That was really explicitly stimulated by a kind of challenge from someone who claimed that theorem-proving technology won't be up to formalizing this kind of proof for another decade or two. I forget what he said. And so I think we really have made a lot of progress in formalization in the last 20 years. Does that to say we do? We also have substantial libraries of mathematics. For example, we have a whole bunch of very nice mathematics in a whole variety of areas, but it's particularly strong in this area of continuous lattices. My own theory of the whole right has a particularly good theory of analysis and topology in Euclidean space. And Comp now, as a result of the odd-order theorem and the mathematical components library, has a very large theory of abstract algebra. According to taste, you can say that that was a byproduct of the proof of the odd-order theorem, or you can say that that was really the main objective, and the odd-order theorem was just a kind of inspiration. And one thing I would like to note is that the sheer size and significance of such libraries is starting to give us stronger motivation to share results. So, back in 1986, when there weren't such substantial libraries, the motivation for going to all that difficulty of somehow importing someone else's results versus just doing it yourself was not very strong. But now when we have these much larger libraries that often, basically person decades of work have gone into them, there's actually a much stronger motivation for results as the QED project envisaged. On the other hand, there are other approaches than PRA-style formalization or even actually proof sharing. Sometimes people basically just, so to speak, hand translate formalizations from one prover to another, because very often, as we all know, it's often half the battle. If you've just got a good sequence of definitions and theorems and lemmas, it's often very straightforward to just fill in the gaps yourself in your own pet theorem prover. So, for example, a lot of the various analysis stuff has been moved over to Isabel Hall in that way. In some ways, it's actually generalized. So maybe we're still not seeing quite as much sharing as we might hope to. But there have been a lot of interfaces between different systems. So there's quite a lot of pioneering work in the late 90s by Doug Howe and Amy Felty, and later by Mark Staples, on at least transferring theorems from one theorem prover to another. That's a relatively modest goal. People have a more ambitious goal also of sharing proofs, which is getting us closer to the kind of QED vision. And we have a lot of instances of that too. So, for example, from Hall 92 Cop by you and Debbie in 2000, Hall 92 Pearl by Nan Moster and Miss Roy, and Hall 4 to Isabel Hall, and Hall Light to Isabel Hall by Sebastian Scalva and Stephen Agua. And then in the other direction, Isabel Hall to Hall Light by Sean McLaughlin, and also Hall Light to Cock by Chantal Keller. And I think those last two are particularly interesting because this one is actually, in principle, from a stronger logic to a weaker logic, because Isabel Hall has type classes on top, so it's a non-trivial task to enforce from in some sense a stronger logic to a weaker logic. And this one is also interesting just because the two logics are so different, the whole light and the Cock logic. But what about the real sort of QED vision of actually sharing using a meta-logic? We don't have much progress, but we do have more comprehensive sharing frameworks like open theory and Mark Adams' Hall Zero that are actually reaching quite a nice sort of professional, usable way of sharing proofs among different Hall systems. They have actually been used for real proofs on a few occasions, like as part of the Hall-in-Hall verification. And I think the thing that's closest to the original QED vision is the Logosphere project. And that was using the 12th logical framework as a kind of common meta-logic. You can find a bit more about the project here. So it certainly by no means has reached the kind of QED comprehensiveness and ubiquity, but nevertheless it does show that some project of the QED sort is certainly feasible. So anyway, those are my reflections. So if I had to summarize, I would say that formalization of theorem projects has come on tremendously in the last 20 years. The original QED vision has not been realized, really. We don't have a kind of current unified theory. On the other hand, when you just look at some of the valuable side effects that the QED project had in just making us aware of other theorem-proving systems and providing a continuing source of inspiration, then I certainly don't think that the QED project was a failure by any means. So, thank you all.
John, you stopped at the present, but can't you go a little into the future as well?
Oh, I see. Yes, of course my ability to look into the future is regrettably limited, but I think it is interesting to notice that there really truly has been a certain coalescing about a somewhat smaller number of theorem-proving systems in recent years. I think possibly homotopy type theory may have ruined this trend by opening up a whole new bifurcation in foundations, but at least they are still, among other things, using COP as a foundation. So it seems that theorem-proving systems do get a kind of critical mass, and the more people start using them, the more libraries get developed, etc., etc. So there is some kind of tendency to coalesce around particular systems. So I actually don't consider it impossible that something like that may happen, but nevertheless, the diversity of current foundations is enough that I'm not sure I do see that happening. So my prediction for the future would probably be that we won't have a really unified QED-like future, at least for a few decades. I think the different threads of foundations and implementation still have a long way to run. Does that answer the question?
Mark, do you think that the mathematicians care very much about all this now or in the past or in the future?
I mean, we're seeing encouraging signs. I mean, I suppose Tom Hales being the outstanding example, of course, of a mathematician who actually found in formalization a solution to his problems rather than just a sort of irrelevant sideline. The difficulty of how to handle large and complex proofs that are really going beyond the current refereeing process. And that's also helped to sort of move us forward to the stage where we're actually formalizing the research frontier, at least in some limited areas, like Tom's proof, even though we're nowhere near on average. So there are certainly encouraging signs, and then of course, Vladimir Vronsky becoming interested in studying the multi-type theory. So there certainly is a lot of genuine interest among some mathematicians. I think as far as many of them go, though, maybe not much has changed in the last 20 years. I don't know if, the average level of the mathematician in the street, or, the mathematician on the platform omnibus, as they used to say, is actually much greater than it was 20 years ago. But perhaps with a few sort of successful beachheads like, Hales and Vronsky, more and more mathematicians will become interested. I should admit, I think a lot of mathematicians are turned off by our systems for one reason or another. Maybe they're repelled by just how the proofs look, or maybe they're repelled by foundations. For example, when I gave a talk at the IHP trimester, which was very dominated by the homotopy type theory, the one mathematician came up to me afterwards and asked in a bewildered fashion, why are so many people interested in types? What's wrong with set theory that all mathematicians use as foundations? And so I think a lot of mathematicians mathematicians are disconcerted either by the proof languages, the primitive interfaces, the limited orientation, the weird foundations, and all of those things don't work in our favour, to be sure.
Last question?
Yeah, just following up on what you were saying, I think you're right that one of the things that puts mathematicians off is the difficulty of understanding very large automated proofs. I mean, part of the motivation of them getting interested is that it does give them a vehicle for tackling very large proofs and ensuring that they're correct. But then mathematicians like really to understand the key ideas behind the proof and the structure of the proof. So do you have any ideas about how we can make our big proofs more understandable to mathematicians and to everybody?
Yes, that's certainly an issue. So I know I was at a conference in Edinburgh a couple of years ago where Michael Gonthier was also giving a talk, and he clearly saw the activity of the mathematician as really divided into two almost independent activities of sort of dreaming up ideas and thinking of theorems, and the work of actually checking the details of the proof. And it was clear that he attached relatively little importance to the, he considered that aspect of checking the proof the boring part of it. You have to do it because it's kind of, so to speak, a legal obligation that you get your proofs right, but it wasn't at all what excited him. What excited him was the concepts and the ideas, etc., etc. Having said that, he was actually quite positive about the idea of proof checking insofar as it could relieve him of that boredom. So I mean, what he's really interested in indeed is sort of new ideas, clear concepts, nice, elegant proofs. But he was certainly quite open to the idea that just for the routine work of checking that you didn't make any mistakes, that it could be delegated to the computer. More generally, how can computers contribute to the process of actually finding new proofs? Well, I mean, it's not inconceivable that computers will actually start to do some interesting concept formation. I mean, there has, as you know better than almost anyone, there has been a certain amount of research in that area with, some somewhat interesting results. And actually some of the stuff Josef Urban has been doing with machine learning is also a little bit interesting in that respect, because you really, at least in principle, have the idea that the computer may actually be able to discover relevant concepts, common patterns that perhaps have eluded us. Nevertheless, I don't think I can imagine the computers surpassing the mathematicians soon. So I think there might be some more modest goal, which goes back to another aspect of your question, just how can computers help us to visualize the proof? People have often talked about, you have this huge proof that just like a kind of user interface allows you to collapse a lot of things into a little plus sign. Perhaps the computer will let you expand and contract bits of the proof according to the level of detail at which you want to view it, so you can just see the skeletons. Anyway, that's a possibility.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's applaud again.
Thank you.
I leave the Skype on in case you want to watch George's talk, but there's no need to. I'll turn you around so no one will know whether you're still there.
There will be a panel discussion in about 9 hours.
Well, I'll set my alarm for that. Thank you very much.
Sorry that I misunderstood or misremembered the timing, so George should have started 10 minutes ago.
my view of what QED was saying. And from my point of view, was a message straight from the logicians to the mathematicians, saying basically, we have the science, we have the technology, and if you give us the funding, we'll build these wonderful checking tools, and you can go on and multiply the formalized theories on your own. And somehow this didn't really happen. And I think the chief reason was that the middle guys were left out of the picture, and really that we didn't really have the tools, we couldn't have the tools at the time because we didn't know what tools to build. Part of it was we didn't know what languages to use to describe mathematics, and we didn't know how to use them. And my work has been chiefly in that area. I haven't built that many tools, but I've been working very hard at understanding how I could make something out of the various tools that were available. And the title of my talk is sort of describing my journey from doing the thing for which I guess I'm still best known, proving the four-color theorem in 2004, and to going and proving the Euler theorem more recently, and try to explain how most of the ideas that expanded to give the proof of the Euler theorem were already present in the four-color theorem. However, in preparing the talk, I realized that actually I needed to go a little further back in history to my first brush with theorem proving, and that was back, well, basically at the start of QED, trying to build a proof of the Campbell garbage collector. So I'll start with that briefly. So this was in sort of really 1992 when Gonthier came out with this pioneering idea of a weight-free multi-processor garbage collector. It wasn't quite weight-free, and I figured with then, the following year, a way of actually making it weight-free. And then we wanted to prove that it was correct. And I knew Leslie, and Leslie had already figured out the basics of TLA and TLA+, and I think it would be a great application for this. So we set out doing this with TLA+, and just modeling the protocol let us discover a couple of errors in our algorithm. So the TLA language describes as a very simple formalism for describing a concurrent system, where you just give actions which are predicates relating previous state and following state. And you can describe this fairly precisely as garbage collector using only 63 actions. You can see that's a fairly precise description because most of the garbage collectors that had been studied at that time could be described in probably 3 or 4 actions. So this is quite faithful to the implementation. And then we built on top of this a safety proof. You don't really need to worry about liveness for a garbage collector for this kind of structure. And that used another methodology invented by Leslie, which is refinement proof. So kind of abstracted the concrete data, very precise concrete data, into more relevant abstract state. When we go to the trouble of writing an abstract algorithm, but we did define the invariance mostly in terms of those definitions, which in turn make the proof much more modular. And then we went on, or mostly I went on, to actually computer check the proof, because there was a proving tool that had been built for TLA Plus at the time. It was based on a combination of an Emacs front end, which allowed you to do split buffer editing, sort of 7 years before it became popular for the more mainstream theorem provers, and what is now a fairly obscure prover for the large specification language. Of course, it was a complete hijacking of that system because it didn't have anything to do with large and algebraic data types. Really what it used was the rewriting engine that was underpinning this prover, which had been stolen from the French. Basically the rewriting engine. And the whole proof was a impressive at the time, but modest by modern day standards, 20K lines of proofs. So early lessons from this. So this is sort of how a proof looked like. So the early lesson was that it was really nice to be able to write readable proofs. Of course, me and people knew that at the time, but my colleagues that were working with Koch were still basically using TTY interfaces and then writing stream of consciousness list of tactics.
But did you know if I went for all the
No. But I quite like this. I wouldn't have started the project if I hadn't had this. And Leslie had very clear ideas about how to write a proof. And he was interested in using this format for writing his paper proofs. And so two-window interaction helped a lot. And in this particular case, because I could actually run LP on my PowerBook at the time, I realized I could actually write those proofs offline and still be able to understand what I was doing. The other thing was that the main proving tool used there was guided rewriting. So the general idea of Larch was that you would have automation to include Bendix. So you would just use the rewriting engine completion to combine together equations in interesting ways and come up with identities. Now, with a stack that large, just throwing all equations in the mix didn't do anything. However, if you were clever enough, what you could do would be to compute critical pairs with definite sets of equations successively. And the rewrite engine would do the brunt work of all the easy reasoning. And that led to rather pleasant style of proof where you had definite control over what was happening. So you could actually write the proof offline and they would run as planned. So that was a great discovery. Semi-automation was actually better than full automation. The downside was that with this system, the system had a very rigid declarative structure. And that made anything that had to deal with quantifiers extremely clumsy. Because you basically needed an extra step anytime you needed to introduce any kind of assumption or anything constant. And that meant that the system was only really usable for flat algorithms and data. Fine for a garbage collector, but I kind of gave up on doing anything else with it because of that limitation. So, on to the four-color theorem. And this is just a quick reminder of how the proof goes. You're probably familiar with the statement, take any map and color it with 4 pens, so that you have adjacent colors. And the way you prove the theorem is that you find a set of partial maps on configurations that have these two properties. One is unavoidable, which means that you're absolutely certain that at least one of their configurations occurs in anything the map considered. And each of these configurations is reducible, which means that if the configuration appears, then you can do some local reasoning around the configuration that lets you construct a coloring by induction. And so the proof, and those two proofs are very big combinatorial arguments. The first one goes into 10,000 cases, the second one involves roughly 1 billion cases. And if you want to do a full proof, you have to verify the combinatorics. You actually have to show that the combination of these criteria is sufficient. Which requires bits of graph theory and analysis, as we'll see just a bit later. So I had an interesting path doing this because remember I was kind of traumatized by my first experience in theorem proving, so I was this from the algorithmic point of view. Starting in '99 by just programming the reducibility decision procedure. Essentially, because I've given it as a programming exercise to some of my students that they could repeat, and realizing that the BDD I needed to implement this could actually be uncached because the cache wasn't doing anything. And that meant that I had a functional program. So perhaps I could write it in Coq and try this newfangled idea of reflection so that I could have a huge combinatorial proof mapped down to very, very small proof terms. So I started trying this. So first, just programming the generation of coloring, so not the full reducibility, but just generating the initial stage of the BDD.
He vanished. He's in America. He was
Joseph Urban?
Yes, that's fine.
Okay, please. Just a second.
And that led to a discovery that actually this reflection thing, it was useful. Of course it would be useful for doing the big proofs, but it was actually useful, very helpful in proving the correctness of those decision procedures. And in fact, it was so helpful a tool for building proofs that I embarked in actually developing hypermaps and trying to prove the combinatorics. So it was because I recognized the pattern that had happened earlier on in the proof of the garbage collector, that rewriting, and in this case computational rewriting, was doing enough of the grunt work. I had to do a little more work than in LP because the simple Coq evaluation is a little weaker than the LP simplifier, or the Gonthier physical simplifier. But it was still doing enough of the job and doing it extremely reliably that I could carry out my proofs. And it led to the discovery that, oh, there was actually a new piece of combinatorics that fit the problem very nicely. And that let me develop a little new map around that. And then in 2004, and I sort of just developed it as a back burner project, not daring to claim anything. And then in 2004, I got a